So, what does Ruth, Boaz's feet, and Jesus' genealogy in Matthew 1 have to do with sexual ethics? Hi there, my name is Dr. Jordan Koss, and this is the Millennial Harbinger channel. Okay, so one of the most amusing days that I have throughout the school year, teaching at least one class that I teach right now is Old Testament survey, is enlightening my students to some of the particular things in a story to give them aha moments to better understand what the story is actually getting at. And one of those days and one of those topics is helping them understand how in Ruth chapter 3, that when it mentions Boaz's feet, that feet is an idiom for male genitalia. And there's giggles, there's laughs, there's some awkwardness, and it's like, okay, guys, let's move on. It just that's helpful to understand the story in terms of what's going on here. Now, Michael Heiser, in his book, Reversing Hermon, which I have right here, Reversing Hermon. This is the first book that I read by Heiser back, I think it was in the summer of 2019. And it was an awesome book. If you haven't read it yet, you should. In chapter 5, he talks about how Ruth being mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus makes sense within what's called the Enochic Watchers Template. Now, Ruth is only mentioned one time in the New Testament. And both that mentioning in Jesus' genealogy and her portrayal in her own story, Heiser argues, makes sense in light of communicating that Jesus is going to reverse the transgression of the Watchers. So really interesting. And he gets a lot of his information and bases a lot of what he says there in chapter 5 when he talks about all 4 women mentioned in Jesus' genealogy. He leans heavily upon a dissertation written by the scholar Amy Richter. And that dissertation is called The Enochic Watchers Template and the Gospel of Matthew. That dissertation was done at Marquette University and finished in 2010. And if you look back in the back of the book in the bibliography, Heiser notes that at that time that he wrote this book, her dissertation was available for free online. And I happened to, Google it and find it also for free online. So I downloaded it, and I'm totally going to read that thing because it's going to be a really, really interesting read. But what Richter's dissertation does, and Heiser's chapter building off of it, it helps answer this question. And that is, why are the 4 women possibly all Gentiles in the bloodline of Jesus? And why are they mentioned there in the bloodline, in the genealogy of Jesus? Now, I'm going to read to you the section of Heiser's chapter called the general thesis. The general thesis, which is repairing the damage caused by the Watchers. And Heiser starts off saying this: New Testament scholar Amy Richter believes that what she calls the Enochic Watchers Template is essential for understanding the women in the genealogy of Jesus. She summarizes this template early in her recent study, beginning of Richter's quote. According to the Enochic Watchers Template, evil came into the world when the Watchers transgressed their heavenly boundary to engage in illicit sexual contact with women and teach them illicit arts. The consequences of the Watchers' transgression are violence, unrighteousness, evil, idolatry, and disease. Some of these consequences come from human use of the skills taught by the Watchers, skills for seduction, war-making, sorcery, and astrology. Heiser goes on to say, for ancient readers of Matthew's Gospel who knew the specifics of Enoch's story of the sins of the Watchers, the theological strategy of the genealogy would have been evident. It was to them, it's not to us, both in my personal experience and in my 10 years of experience in full-time ministry. Richter notes again, end quote, Heiser quotes Richter saying, the writer of the gospel according to Matthew was familiar with themes and traditions about the antediluvian patriarch Enoch, including the story of the fall of the Watchers, and shows that Jesus brings about the eschatological repair of the consequences of the Watchers' fall. In Matthew's gospel, the foreshadowing of the repair and then the repair itself are seen in the evangelist's genealogy and infancy narrative. Going on with this quote, the women of the Hebrew Bible, named by Matthew in his genealogy of Jesus, foreshadow the reversal of the Watchers' transgression. All 4 of them are connected with the Enochic Watchers Template. They use the illicit arts, but the use of these skills leads to righteousness rather than evil. The women are also connected with other aspects of the Enochic Watchers Template, including sexual interaction which connects the earthly and heavenly realms, interaction with angels, unusual aspects of their offspring, and connections with giants. Again, final paragraph of this quote. In the birth narrative, Matthew shows the birth of Jesus occurring in a way that reverses the Watcher's transgression and evil in the world, as it occurs in the Enochic Template. Specifically, the birth of Jesus occurs through the union of a woman and a celestial being, but in contrast to the Watcher's story, no sexual relations were involved. Further, in Matthew's narrative, the first humans outside of Jesus' immediate family to interact with the child Jesus are the Magi, who are practitioners of the illicit arts taught by the Watchers and use astrological knowledge to find Jesus. In the Enochic Template, the Watchers bring idolatry into the world. In Matthew, the Magi worship the appropriate object of worship, namely Jesus. And Heiser says, Richter notes an ironic subtext to the fact that Matthew draws attention to the reversal of the sins of the Watchers through the four women. Quote, Jesus completes what Enoch does not. That is, Jesus is able to bring about the eschatological repair of the consequences of the fall of the Watchers. Very interesting, right? Okay, so what I want to do is I want to focus on Ruth and how the Enochic Watchers Template can help us understand both her mentioning in the genealogy and understand the overall story of Ruth itself and what happens in there. And here's how Heiser can help us do that in his book, Reversing Hermon. So on page 79, he first talks about Rahab. And when you talk about Rahab, you got to talk about Boaz, because Boaz was the offspring, was the child of, mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1, was the child of Rahab and a man by the name of Salmon, Matthew 1, verse 5. Heiser says, on the surface, nothing seems unusual, but Ruth 2:1 refers to Boaz as a Gibor, one of the terms used to describe the Nephilim offspring of the sons of God in Genesis 4:6. On its own, Gibor, plural Giborim, does not refer to giants. However, Jews in the Second Temple period often interpreted the term that way. Okay. However, Jews in this, mentioned that already, the Septuagint, for example, translates the term gigas or gigantes, giant or giants, over a dozen times, whether the context supports the rendering or not. The point being made here is not that Boaz was a giant. Heiser says he was not. Rather, the point is that the description used by the author of Ruth drew attention of these Second Temple Jews, Matthew being one of them, and created a mental link between Rahab and the giant clans. And as well, like we can see that link between, as a result, Boaz and the giant clans as well. Okay, so there's a little bit about Boaz and his interesting lineage, right? Half Israelite, half Canaanite, not only half Canaanite, but half Canaanite, of a woman who lived in a city that God said devoted to destruction. And God said devote to destruction a lot of those cities and locations where the Rephaim, the descendants of the Nephilim, lived. And that Heiser argues in other places and in other books that was the purpose of the conquest, not to kill all the Canaanites, but to only eradicate the competing bloodline of the Nephilim offspring. Okay, so what of Ruth? All right, let's read Ruth now on pages 80 to 83, just a few pages. It's not long, but this is some really cool stuff. So let's start here. Like Rahab, Ruth is clearly a Gentile being from Moab, Ruth 1:4, right? The book of Ruth starts out, everybody dies. They moved to Moab, which was something an Israelite was not supposed to do. So bad. Maybe there's some idolatrous subtext going on there at the beginning of Ruth, because they stay there. They marry two Moabite women. Ruth is one of them. That's something, again, you're not supposed to do as a faithful Israelite. All bad news is how the story of Ruth begins. Heiser says, Richter observes, another paragraph quote of Richter, like Tamar, whom Tamar is also mentioned at the end of the book of Ruth, which is interesting in and of itself. Like Tamar, Ruth has found herself widowed with no child, and Ruth also will transgress social mores to gain security and a child. Because she is a Moabite, Ruth is connected with three aspects of the Watcher's legacy: illicit sexual intercourse, bloodshed, and idolatry. Further, Moabites share with those of illicit birth the status of being excluded from the assembly of the Lord. The designation of illegitimate birth is also applied at the Qumran to the offspring of the Watchers and the women. Very, very interesting. Okay. And you remember the origination of the Moabites is one of the offspring, one of the children born between Lot and his daughters at the end of the Sodom and Gomorrah story in Genesis 19. So much like the flood narrative is framed by two stories about sex, right? The sins of the watchers in Genesis, beginning of Genesis 6, and then the sin of Noah's son in Genesis 9, whether it was with Noah himself or Noah's wife. And then you've got here how Sodom and Gomorrah is framed by the sins of the men of Sodom and Gomorrah wanting to have sex, ironically, with people who they thought were men but were actually angels at the beginning. And at the end, it's framed by another sex story, the story of Lot's daughters having sex with Lot and then having Ammon and Moab, who end up being enemies, related, but enemies of Israel. Okay, moving forward. Readers, Heiser says, will recall that in the story of Ruth, her Israelite mother-in-law, Naomi, comes up with a plan that, if successful, would result in Boaz redeeming Ruth through marriage, thereby ending their desperate, poverty-stricken situation. Scholars, Heiser continues, of the Hebrew Bible have long recognized that what Ruth does at the threshing floor in Ruth 3 is overtly sexual. Ruth exposes the quote-unquote feet of Boaz while he is sleeping after he had eaten and drunk, when his heart was merry, and then he lies down, Ruth 3, verse 7. The Hebrew word translated feet, regel, is also a well-known euphemism for genitalia in the Hebrew Bible, e.g., like to cover one's feet, meaning relieve oneself, Judges 3:24, 1 Samuel 24:4. By uncovering Boaz's feet or genitalia, Ruth is, in effect, offering herself as a wife to Boaz. Given the patriarchal setting of Israelite culture, this was a transgression of the way things were usually done. It was the man who would solicit marriage or take a concubine of his choice. While the text provides, Heiser says, no evidence of a sexual encounter between the two, what Ruth did would have an illicit feel to proper Israelites and later Jewish readers. Interesting. For our purposes, he says, what leads up to Ruth's offer is noteworthy. And here again, he quotes Richter. Richter says, Ruth's encounter with Boaz on the threshing floor is orchestrated by the design of Naomi, who instructs Ruth in how the night should progress. Specifically, Naomi instructs Ruth to wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes and go down to the threshing floor, Ruth 3:3. At its most innocuous, Richter says, Naomi is merely telling Ruth to make herself presentable, to, quote, pretty her face up for her encounter with Boaz. However, Richter says, since the intended result is to put Boaz in a position of being obligated to marry Ruth, it may be more realistic to see Naomi as encouraging Ruth to make use of the arts of seduction, specifically those named as illicit arts in the Enochic tradition. Accordingly, Ruth makes use of cosmetic adornment, ointment, perfume, specifically identified as one of the illicit arts, as well as putting on her finest raiment in order to be more attractive to Boaz. Ruth is a Moabite, a fact mentioned no less than 7 times in the book. Chapter 1, verse 4, chapter 1:22, chapter 2:2, chapter 2, verse 6, chapter 2, verse 21, chapter 4, verse 5, and chapter 4, verse 10. In Israelite tradition, okay, Richter says, Moabites were associated with idolatry and their women with sexual wantonness and seduction of Israelite men. This association comes from the episode of the worship of Baal Peor, recorded in Numbers 25, end quote. And it's interesting to note how the worship and sin and transgression of the Israelites at Baal Peor is kind of like the Israelites' second generation Mount Sinai sin. Whereas that first generation from the Exodus, out of Egypt, sinned at Mount Sinai, idolatry, worshiped the golden calf, and they played, which is like an idiom for illicit sexual activity. So did the second generation that came out of the wilderness wandering. It camped at Baal Peor before entering the promised land by the leadership of Joshua. Interesting connection there between both generations and what they did at Mount Sinai and Baal Peor. Heiser continues, and he says, Ruth and Boaz, of course, do get married. They famously become the great-grandparents of King David, interestingly, Ruth 4:18 through 22. Having a Moabitess in the line of David was a scandal that later rabbis felt required explanation. Deuteronomy 23, 2 through 3 was a focal point, he says, and he quotes that passage. No one born of a forbidden union, mamzer in Hebrew, may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of his descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord. Even to the 10th generation, none of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever. End quote. And Heiser highlights that fact that the term mamzer for Deuteronomy 23:2 is significant. It is the term behind the famous designation of the giant offspring of the Watchers as bastard spirits in Second Temple Jewish literature, especially the Dead Sea Scrolls. David Jackson, another scholar, Heiser references here in his scholarly work on Enochic Judaism, explains we find the concept of bastard, mamzer, drawn from Deuteronomy 23, 2 through 4, and Zechariah chapter 9, verse 6, applied to the offspring of the angels and the women throughout the Qumran literature. Very interesting observation there. And Heiser says, lastly, his last thought here on the person of Ruth, based upon why we find her in Jesus' genealogy. Lastly, and this is kind of cool, it is interesting to note that the rabbinic tradition was aware of all this material and, as rabbinic interpreters often do, made it fodder for imaginative interpretation, such as Orpah, the other Moabite woman that one of Elimelech's sons married while they lived in Moab. In the beginning of Ruth, Orpah, Ruth's sister, was believed. I don't even know if she was Ruth's sister or that if it says it was Ruth's sister. Maybe it does at the beginning of Ruth. But Orpah, Heiser says, Ruth's sister, was believed to be the mother of Goliath and his brothers in rabbinic tradition. Some rabbis presumed Orpah had giant Emim blood as a Moabitess. The Babylonian Talmud, for instance, B. Sota, reads, It is written, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave unto her. Let the sons of the kiss, the one who kissed, fall into the hands of the one who clave unto. As it is written, these four were born to the giant in Gath, and fell by the hand of David. Rabbah taught, because of the 4 tears Orpah shed on her mother-in-law, she was worthy that 4 mighty men would come forth out of her as her offspring. And that's just kind of really cool how, I had a student ask in class, like, hey, what happened to Orpah? And I'm like, well, I don't know. It's like we're not told, because in the Hebrew text it is like that's the last we hear about her, but not so in rabbinic tradition apparently. This opinion is speculative in rabbinic tradition, Heiser says, but given Matthew's inclusion of Ruth in the genealogy of Jesus, Jews perhaps saw Ruth as immune from monstrous offspring due to her conversion to Naomi's God. Or perhaps that David was a marker of messianic things to come, one who would blunt and combat the transgressions of the Watchers. So what do we learn here in terms of Ruth, Boaz's feet, her mention in the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew 1, and sexual ethics? Well, I just want to quickly wrap up here with this thought. The ironic subtext that Heiser mentions, and he mentions in light of Richter's dissertation on the Enochic Watchers Template in the beginning of Matthew, the ironic subtext to Matthew's genealogy, right, is the same ironic subtext that should help us understand every passage in the New Testament that deals with talking about sinful sexual behavior and activity. Right? Especially Romans 1. The Enochic Watchers Template should serve as our subtext to understand what the first century Jewish Christian enchanted writers had to say about sexual behavior, especially sinful sexual behavior. So why Ruth? Why is Ruth even in the Bible? Like, one of my pet peeves is the moralization of biblical stories and biblical passages where it's like, okay, I don't know how to read this, so let's Disneyfy it and try to bring a moral out of this story. So why is Ruth in the Hebrew Bible? It's not for us to moralize into here's how you're supposed to behave as a Christian. It's not that. I mean, we can draw good principles from it, but that's perhaps not the initial or main thrust and focus of why the Hebrew people ended up putting the book of Ruth in the canon. We need to stay away from moralism and try to read the stories and passages about sex, which are a lot in the Hebrew and New Testament, the First Testament and the Second Testament. We need to read the stories and passages all throughout the Bible with the consideration of Genesis 6, the Enochic Watchers Template, in our mind, in the background. Okay? And so we need to insert this subtext, like the biblical authors did, into our own conversations and thinking when it comes to same-sex sexual activity, when it comes to homosexuality. Because if we don't, that's going to really affect us in terms of how we read Paul and how we read other New Testament writers, how we understand the Old Testament stories. We need to have that Enochic Watchers template in our mind when we come to specifically passages like Romans chapter 1. Okay, that's it for this episode. Thank you for joining us and following with us all the way to the end. This is Dr. Jordan Koss. We will see you next time on the Millennial Harbinger channel. Goodbye.